Hello and welcome. My name is George Pickering and I'm a member of IATEFL, the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. And it's my very great pleasure to deliver this talk on how to create teacher association budgets. Before I start, I'd like to say a very big thank you to the British Council Senegal for organising these seminars and making them possible, and for their long-term commitment to helping in the development of teacher associations in the region. These seminars have been specially designed for TAs in the region. Some of the TAs are at a fairly advanced stage of development, many others are at the developmental stage. And the idea of these seminars is to help those TAs in the next steps in the journey of their development. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why I think this is a subject that is worth discussing on this webinar. And I'm going to start with a quotation from Nicolas Cage, the actor, who said, "To some, money is like a foreign film without subtitles." There are many people who are leading and managing teacher associations who know a lot about education, but perhaps know a little less about finance. The idea of this seminar is to help those people who are running teacher associations to know more about how to manage the finances of their association. This isn't a seminar for people with MBAs. This isn't a seminar for people with a background in finance. This is a seminar for people who feel they need to know more about how to manage the finances of their teacher association. And I hope at the end of this seminar you will have felt that I have given you some subtitles to help you understand finance, and in particular how to create TA budgets. So some of the key questions that one might want to ask about the finances of a teacher association are: how can you meet the needs of your members given your finite resources? As far as I'm aware, there is no teacher association throughout the world who has the problem of not knowing how they can spend their money. Most teacher associations are in the position of having to make a little go a long way. The next question we might ask is, how can you increase your income? How can you increase the money that comes into your teacher association? And thirdly, how can you keep down your costs? So before we talk about budgets specifically, let's start with a warmer activity. I'd just like you to spend a couple of moments to think about what are the sources of income of your TA, your teacher association. Where does your money come from? And what are your major expenses? What are your major outgoings? So there's money coming in, money coming out. What are your major income sources and what are your major expenses? Now, TAs are all different, but for many TAs, three of the biggest sources of their income are membership fees. That's the amount a member pays to be a member of a TA. The second one might be a surplus from conference and other events, and the third one might be sponsorship. And I suspect that for many TAs, these three revenue streams amount to a large part of your income. Of course, there are other models. There are also alternative sources of income. And perhaps sometimes it's worth considering, are there any sources of income that we are not exploiting at the moment? So looking at that list, was it similar to yours or was it different? Having looked at income, let's think about what are your major expenses. And once again, every TA is different. What are the major expenses of your TA? This is a list of what your major expenses might be. Similar to yours or different? Having discussed in general terms what are your major sources of income, what are your major expenses, let's now move on to budgets. Let's have a look at the who, the why, the what, the when, and the how. And let's look at some specific questions. Firstly, well, what is a budget? Secondly, why are budgets important? Thirdly, what types of budgets might you want to set? Fourthly, what challenges might you face in drawing up a budget? And finally, how do you devise a budget? So let's start with the most obvious question first. What is a budget? Well, a budget is an organisational plan stated in monetary terms. So in other words, it's a financial plan for your association. And it might be a list of all your planned expenses and revenues for a particular time period, or it could be a budget for a particular event. As George W. Bush said, I can tell it's a budget, it's got lots of numbers in it. Quite clearly, a budget has lots of numbers in it, and the point of those numbers is to help us to plan the financial future of our association. If we move on to the second question, what type of budget might you want to set? Well, typically you might want to set a budget for any events that you hold. I think it's particularly important that you have a conference budget. And thirdly, it's important that you have an annual budget for the association. So there are three key types of budgets that you might want to consider setting. Third question, why are budgets important? Why bother? Well, firstly, it does help you to plan and prioritise how you are going to spend your income in the future. Secondly, it ensures organisational transparency. If you are a leader of a teacher association, you are accountable to your members and maybe to other regulatory bodies for the way that that association is run. You need to show to others that you have properly looked after the resources of the association, that you have set a budget, and following on from that, that you have audited accounts for your association. It's also useful because it helps you to look at the actual financial performance of your association against your budget forecast. So in other words, the budget is the anticipated spend and expenditure, and that can be used as a measure against which you look at your actual financial performance. And of course, another thing about a budget and the accounts that follow from it is it helps you to determine the financial health of your association. In other words, it helps you to calculate at the end of the conference or at the end of a financial period whether or not you've made a profit or loss or a surplus or a deficit. Now, when we're talking about income and expenditure, I'm always reminded of Mr. Micawber from Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. He had a quotation where he said, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19 shillings and 6, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 and 6 result misery. So at the end of any financial period, we need to know whether or not we're in a happy situation or perhaps a miserable one. Annual accounts. At the end of a financial period, you will be looking at your income, and when you've deducted from that expenditure, you will know what your surplus or deficit for the year is. Let's spend a moment looking at a budgetary cycle. The budgetary cycle tells us that at some point you will set your budget. You will then, during the financial period, monitor the budget, see how your income and expenditure is going. At some future point, you will review the situation of the association, and then you will decide your objectives for a conference or for the year, which will then lead you to set another budget. Now, what challenges might you meet in setting a budget? Firstly, as we mentioned at the beginning of this talk, there is always the danger that there is a lack of financial expertise or experience within the association. Secondly, you often have to set a budget before the current financial year has finished. When you're setting budgets, you are making best guesses about future events. And in any association, you have competing priorities and interests. So while you are setting the budget, people are coming forward with all sorts of good ideas as to how your limited resources can be spent. And finally, of course, there is the fact that you are often setting a budget with very little income. Is this a reason for not setting a budget? I would argue the opposite. I would argue that the challenges are some of the reasons why we need to make sure that our associations are properly run and that we have the best budgets that we can possibly have. So, how do you go about setting a budget? Well, firstly, you need to decide who is going to be involved. Next, you need to decide when and how you are going to set it. Then you need to gather all the information that you need. Following on from that, you need to calculate your income for the year. And then you need to calculate also your expenditure for the year. I would suggest in most years you need to ensure that income exceeds expenditure, and then you need to agree the budget at least with the rest of the TA Central or Coordinating Committee. So who is going to be involved in the budgeting process? The Treasurer, the committee, the members. In many associations, the Treasurer might be the person who draws up the draft. But a budget is so important that it needs to be something that is agreed by the whole committee. And in some associations, it might be appropriate to discuss budgets with the membership at large. The next question is when and how are you going to set the budget? Well, when? There's obviously no definitive answer to this question, but my general advice would be as early as possible. So in other words, if you're setting a conference budget, as soon as you start planning the conference, you should be starting to draw up your budget. How are you going to devise the budget? Could it be a face-to-face meeting, telephone conference call, email exchange? All these are possible. But because the budget is such an important part of the administration of a TA, I feel at the very least that everybody on the committee should have a chance to input into the discussions about the budget. What kind of information do you need to create a budget? Well, if they are available, you certainly need a copy of the association's accounts for previous years. You need any financial updates. In other words, you need any information about how your financial expenditure is going. You need to know about current membership figures. You need to know about current membership trends. In other words, is your membership going up, or is it going down, or is it pretty static? You need a copy of any strategic plan or annual plan, so you know what the general aims and objectives of the association are. And you also need any quotes or estimates for items you've already planned for example, buying equipment and things like that. So that's a range of the type of information you need at hand when devising a budget. Next, you need to calculate your income for the year. And the best way, I think, to predict the future is to base it on the past. So what are your past membership figures? What are your previous sales figures? What do they tell you about what the situation is likely to be in the future? And when you're calculating your income for the year, I think it's good to be prudent. It's good not to be over-optimistic in your predictions of future income. So what are your sources of income? Well, remember we said before that it might be, for example, membership subscriptions, events and conference surpluses. So think about those and make predictions for each of those items. Maybe they include other things as well. For example, advertising revenue might be about people, for example, putting adverts in your newsletters or in your conference program. So, having determined what your revenue streams are, you then need to calculate, for example, your membership income. And simply, you multiply your anticipated number of members by the unit fee that they pay. And similarly, you calculate the other items of income so that you arrive at a figure for your total income. Having calculated your annual income, you move over to expenditure. And of course, the important thing to remember here is that you have to cut your coat according to your cloth and only spend what funds you have available. And I would recommend that you ensure that you cover essential expenses first, and these would include the services that you provide your members. In other words, events and newsletters. And at the same time, while you're calculating your expenditure, this might be a good time to consider ways of reducing your admin costs. For example, by holding meetings through Skype calls or holding virtual meetings. So, as we said earlier, these are some of the items of expenditure that you might want to put in your budget. And having considered what items you need to cover, you also need then to put figures against the anticipated expenditure, for example, for a particular year. So we've talked about annual income, we've talked about annual expenditure. What's the best way of bringing all of these together? Well, for many people, the best way to do this would be to use a simple Excel spreadsheet. And as you can see on the screen, you've got a simple budget here with income here, total figure for income there. You've got expenditure here and total figure for expenditure. And at the bottom, you have a figure for the income over expenditure. In other words, the surplus that you anticipate making in that particular time period. And of course, the idea of using an Excel spreadsheet is you can play with the figures. So for example, here, the amount of money from individual subscriptions has been increased, and as you can see, that has an impact on the total income, which also then has an impact on income over expenditure. So far we've looked at establishing our budget, we've talked about our anticipated income, We've talked about our anticipated expenditure, and through the use of a simple Excel spreadsheet, we've come up with our budget. Now, as I said earlier on, I think it's important that you ensure that income exceeds expenditure. So in other words, if you are a teacher association, you have some reserves. You have money unspent from previous financial years. But those reserves, I would suggest, should not be used to cover operational expenses, but those reserves should be used for special agreed projects. So when setting a budget, wherever possible, I would suggest that you should ensure that income exceeds expenditure. And I'd also suggest that while you're setting a budget, it is an opportunity to review your figures and think again about the additional ways in which you might increase your income and reduce your expenditure. For example, think about different ways of getting sponsorship. Sponsorship, of course, can come in different forms. It can come in terms of money, it can come in terms of grant, and it can come also in terms of services or people's time. Now, having discussed the budget, I think it's important that it's very clear that all of the committee agree with the budget, and that this is very clearly stated in the minutes of a meeting of the committee. Having established the budget, it's also important to monitor actual performance against budget. And if you have a look on the screen, you can see there an example where at the end of a financial period, the actual income and expenditure is compared with the budget predictions. And as you can see, in this particular case, the figures are fairly similar, but they are different. And having monitored the actual performance against budget, you're in a good situation to review the financial situation of the association. And to remind you once again of the budgetary cycle, you've set a budget, you've monitored performance, and now you can do your review of the finances. And on the basis of that review, you are in a better position to be able to decide what your objectives are in relation to the needs of teachers and in relation to the financial resources that are available to you. I hope you found this seminar of use to you. I hope that it's helped to demystify for some of you the whole process of budgeting and given you insight into the language of finance. I hope it's given you greater confidence in how you can manage the finances of your association. If you want to go further into the subject, I suggest you could read the chapters in the book on finance, the chapters in the book called Running an Association for Language Teachers, Directions and Opportunities. This is edited by Susanna Gomez and is published by IATEFL and the British Council. And if you can't get hold of a physical copy of the book, you can actually download it from the British Council's Teaching English website. Finally, action points. At the end of this talk, I just wonder if there are any action points that you feel you and your association need to take. Having looked at the way that the budgetary cycle works, having looked at how you construct a budget, what would be some action points? Is there anything that you might want to do differently in your association? It has been said that there are three types of people in the world: those that can count and those that can't. Most people who are managing teacher associations are not as confident as they might be in terms of finance, in terms of budgets. I hope that in some small way this seminar has helped you to understand better budgets, has helped you to understand their importance, and given you some pointers in how to set budgets in the future. And finally, I want to thank you and congratulate you for getting to the end of this webinar. And my last point is good luck.